The most dangerous lies are the ones you tell yourself every day. I used to think I was good at hiding things. After all, I had practice. Every morning before work, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror inside my small apartment on the north side of Chicago and rehearsed the same smile. Not a big smile. Not a fake smile. Just enough to convince people that everything was normal. Just enough to stop questions before they started. By the time I arrived at the city library, I looked exactly like the person everyone expected me to be. Reliable. Friendly. Organized. The woman who remembered patrons' names and recommended books to children on Saturday mornings. The woman who never complained. The woman who always said she was fine. The strange thing about pretending is that eventually other people start believing you. Then one day, you almost believe yourself. That Thursday evening began like any other. The library closed at 7. I spent the last hour shelving returns and helping an elderly man find a history book he had been searching for all week. Outside, the city glowed beneath the early autumn sunset. The air carried that familiar chill that arrives before winter. I gathered my things, wrapped my coat around myself, and walked 3 blocks to Romano's. Most people knew it as one of the finest restaurants in Chicago. I knew it as the one place where nobody expected anything from me. The hostess knew my name. The staff knew my order. It was quiet enough to think and busy enough to disappear. I settled into my usual corner table beside the window. A cup of tea arrived a few minutes later. I opened a novel and tried to lose myself inside someone else's story. It almost worked. Almost. Then a voice interrupted my concentration. "You always sit at the same table." I looked up. Adrian Romano stood beside me. Everyone in Chicago knew who he was. Successful businessman. Owner of restaurants, hotels, and more companies than most people could count. Yet he carried himself differently than powerful men usually did. He did not demand attention. He noticed things. That somehow felt more intimidating. I smiled politely. I like routines. His gaze lingered on me for a second longer than normal. Not uncomfortable. Just observant. "So do I," he said. Then his eyes narrowed slightly. A breeze had slipped through the restaurant entrance when a customer arrived. A loose strand of hair shifted across my face. For a brief moment, part of what I had spent months hiding became visible. My stomach tightened immediately. Instinctively, I moved my hand toward my cheek. Too late. Adrian had already seen it. The room remained filled with conversation and soft music, but suddenly it felt silent. He did not ask questions. He did not make a scene. He simply looked at me with an expression I could not quite understand. Concern. Recognition. Certainty. It lasted only a few seconds. Then he sat down across from me. "Madison," he said quietly, "how long have you been telling people that everything is fine?" My heart stopped. Because for months, nobody had noticed. Not coworkers. Not neighbors. Not friends. Nobody. Yet somehow, after a single glance, Adrian Romano had seen straight through the lie I had been living. I should have left the restaurant that night. Looking back, that would have been the easier choice. Smile politely. Thank Adrian for his concern. Insist everything was fine. Walk out the door and continue pretending. It was the script I had followed for months. The problem was that Adrian Romano did not seem interested in following anyone else's script. After he asked the question, silence settled between us. Around us, glasses clinked softly. Waiters moved between tables. A pianist played somewhere near the back of the restaurant. Life continued exactly as before. Yet I felt as though the entire room had narrowed to one table and one impossible question. How long had I been telling people everything was fine? The honest answer was longer than I wanted to admit. Long enough to forget what honesty sounded like. I forced a small laugh and reached for my tea. "You're imagining things." Adrian leaned back slightly. Most people would have accepted the answer. He did not. "No," he said calmly. "I do not think I am." His voice remained gentle. There was no accusation in it. No judgment. Somehow that made it harder. I stared down at the steam rising from my cup. "Everyone has difficult weeks." "Weeks?" he asked quietly. "Or months?" My grip tightened around the handle. The conversation felt dangerous, Not because of what he might do, but because of what he might understand. Understanding was harder to escape than curiosity. Curiosity asked questions. Understanding already knew where to look. Adrian did not push further. Instead, he surprised me by changing the subject completely. He asked about the library. My favorite books. The reading program I organized for local children every Saturday morning. Slowly, the tension eased. For nearly 30 minutes, we talked about ordinary things. Yet, even while discussing novels and authors, I sensed something unusual. Adrian listened. Really listened. Most conversations felt like people waiting for their turn to speak. This felt different. When I finally stood to leave, it was nearly 9 o'clock. The restaurant had grown quieter. I gathered my coat and bag. "Thank you for the tea," I said. Adrian smiled faintly. "You paid for your own tea." I laughed to spite myself. "Then thank you for the conversation." His expression softened. "Madison." I stopped. "You do not have to tell me anything tonight." Relief appeared before I could hide it. Then he added, "But someday, I hope you stop carrying everything alone." The words followed me all the way home. The next morning, I convinced myself the conversation was over. I returned to work. Shelved books. Helped students find research materials. Recommended novels to retirees. Everything looked normal. Everything felt familiar. Yet once you know someone has seen through your disguise, pretending becomes harder. Over the following week, I noticed Adrian occasionally appearing at the restaurant during the same hours I visited. He never cornered me. Never pressured me. Sometimes he only nodded from across the room. Other times we exchanged a few words about books or city events. The strange part was that he never mentioned our conversation again. Not once. Yet his silence seemed intentional. As if he understood that trust could not be demanded. It had to be given freely. Then, one rainy Tuesday evening, I arrived at the restaurant and found a small package waiting at my usual table. No note. No explanation. Inside was a first edition copy of my favorite novel. Tucked between the pages was a simple bookmark. On it, handwritten in neat black ink, were 7 words. "You deserve the same kindness you give." For several seconds, I could only stare at the message. Because after months of hiding, deflecting, and pretending, someone had finally noticed the thing I had worked hardest to conceal. Not the mark I kept covered. The loneliness underneath it. The bookmark stayed inside my purse for days. I told myself it was only a thoughtful gesture. A kind message from a man who happened to notice things other people missed. Yet every time I opened my bag, those 7 words seemed to look back at me. "You deserve the same kindness you give." It was such a simple sentence. That was what made it powerful. Most people complimented what you did. Very few people reminded you that you mattered too. The following week brought colder weather to Chicago. Leaves gathered along sidewalks. Gray clouds drifted across the skyline. At the library, preparations for the annual Children's Reading Festival consumed most of my time. I welcomed the distraction. Organizing schedules and activities left little room for overthinking. At least that was the plan. Unfortunately, life rarely follows plans. One Wednesday afternoon, I was arranging a display of new arrivals when my coworker Emily appeared beside me holding a stack of books. "You know," she said casually, "you seem happier lately." I nearly dropped the novel in my hands. "Happier?" She nodded. "Lighter somehow." I forced a smile. "Maybe I am just sleeping better." The answer sounded convincing enough. Yet later that evening, I found myself thinking about her comment. Was I happier? Nothing significant had changed. My apartment was the same. My job was the same. My routine remained exactly as predictable as before. And yet, somewhere beneath the surface, something felt different. Perhaps because for the first time in months, I no longer felt completely invisible. That realization followed me into Romano's later that night. The restaurant was unusually busy. Every table seemed occupied. Conversations blended with soft music and the clink of glassware. I expected to spend an hour reading before heading home. Instead, I found Adrian already sitting at my usual table. A second cup of tea rested across from him. Waiting. "I was beginning to think you changed restaurants," he said as I approached. I laughed to spite myself. "And disappoint your staff?" "Never." His eyes warmed with amusement. Good. They like you. How do you know? Because they talk about you. I shook my head and settled into the chair opposite him. The conversation flowed easily after that. Books. Travel. Childhood memories. Favorite places in the city. Nothing dramatic. Nothing personal. Yet every subject somehow felt meaningful. Adrian had a way of making ordinary conversations feel important. Halfway through the evening, a group entered the restaurant and paused near our table. One of the women recognized Adrian immediately. They exchanged greetings before continuing toward the dining room. As they walked away, I noticed something curious. The woman glanced back at me with obvious interest. Adrian noticed it too. What was that about? I asked. A faint smile appeared. People are curious. About what? His gaze met mine. About the only person in the city who talks to me like I am normal. The answer caught me off guard. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Adrian leaned forward slightly. Madison, can I ask you something? My stomach tightened unexpectedly. Maybe. His expression grew thoughtful. When was the last time someone asked how you were and actually waited for the answer? The question landed with surprising force. Because I immediately realized I could not remember. And judging by the look in Adrian Romano's eyes, he already knew that. For the rest of that evening, Adrian's questions stayed with me long after I returned home. When was the last time someone asked how I was and actually waited for the answer? The truth was uncomfortable. I could remember plenty of people asking. Coworkers. Neighbors. Casual friends. But most of those conversations followed the same script. How are you? I am fine. Then everyone moved on. Nobody expected the truth. Most of the time, neither did I. The next morning, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror holding a cup of coffee. Pale sunlight filtered through the window. The apartment was quiet except for the distant sounds of traffic below. For months, this mirror had been my stage. Every day, I practiced looking normal. Every day, I rehearsed being okay. Yet as I stared at my reflection, Adrian's voice echoed in my mind. You do not have to tell me anything tonight. But someday, I hope you stop carrying everything alone. I looked away first. At the library, the annual reading festival was only 2 weeks away. Parents called with questions. Volunteers finalized schedules. Children arrived excited about the event. Usually, the activity helped distract me. Instead, I found myself noticing something I had ignored for months. I was tired. Not physically. Emotionally. Tired of calculating every angle before entering a room. Tired of deciding which side of my face to turn toward people. Tired of pretending that everything was effortless. That afternoon, Emily joined me during lunch. She studied me for several seconds before speaking. Can I tell you something? She asked. I nodded. You seem different lately. I laughed softly. That again. She smiled. Not happier this time. My stomach tightened. Then what? Emily considered her answer carefully. More honest. The words surprised me because I had not actually told anyone anything. Yet perhaps honesty begins long before confession. Perhaps it begins the moment you stop pretending quite so hard. Later that evening, I walked to Romano's beneath a sky filled with low gray clouds. The restaurant was quieter than usual. A few tables were occupied. Soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers. Adrian sat near the window reviewing documents when I arrived. He closed the folder immediately and stood. Good evening, Madison. Good evening. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he noticed something. Not the thing I had spent months hiding. Something else. You are not wearing sunglasses. I blinked. He was right. For months I had worn them whenever possible, even on cloudy days. It had become such a habit that I no longer questioned it. Yet today, I had left them at home. Adrian did not smile. He did not celebrate the observation. He simply nodded as though recognizing a small victory I had not noticed myself. We sat together near the window. Outside, city lights reflected against wet pavement. Inside, warmth filled the room. For several minutes, we talked about nothing important. Then, unexpectedly, my voice became quieter. What if people see me differently? Adrian looked at me carefully. Who? Everyone. The answer escaped before I could stop it. His expression softened immediately. Madison, he said gently, the people who care about you are not waiting for perfection. They are waiting for the truth. For the first time in months, I felt my carefully built walls shift ever so slightly. Not enough to fall. Just enough to let a little light through. The first real truth I told Adrian Romano happened on a cold Friday evening nearly a month after he noticed what everyone else had missed. It did not happen because he pressured me. It happened because he never did. By then, the reading festival had ended successfully. Hundreds of children had visited the library. Parents filled out thank you cards. Volunteers celebrated with coffee and pastries in the staff room. Everyone called it a success. I smiled and thanked them. Yet when the building finally emptied and the lights dimmed, I found myself sitting alone among stacks of books, feeling strangely emotional. Not sad. Not happy. Just exhausted from carrying so much for so long. That evening, I walked to Romano's through the crisp November air. The city glowed beneath strings of holiday lights that had begun appearing across storefronts. Inside the restaurant, warmth wrapped around me immediately. Adrian was seated near the fireplace reading a report. He looked up when I entered and immediately closed the folder. Somehow, despite managing companies worth millions, he always made it seem as though whatever conversation was about to happen mattered more. We shared dinner, talked about the festival, laughed about a child who had insisted that every book should include dragons regardless of the subject. The conversation felt easy, familiar, safe. Then a silence settled between us. Not awkward, comfortable. The kind of silence that only exists when two people no longer feel obligated to fill every empty space. Adrian studied the fire for a moment before speaking. You look tired. Most people would have said I looked fine. That difference mattered. I stared into my tea. For several seconds, I considered giving my usual answer. Then something unexpected happened. I simply could not do it anymore. I am tired, I admitted quietly. The words felt heavier than they should have. Adrian said nothing. He waited. Just like he always did. I looked down at my hands. Do you know what the hardest part is? He shook his head gently. Nobody knows I am struggling because I worked so hard making sure nobody could tell. The confession hung in the air between us. I expected embarrassment. Instead, I felt relief. Small. Fragile. But real. For months, I continued. I convinced myself that if I kept smiling, eventually everything would feel normal again. Adrian listened carefully. Did it work? A sad laugh escaped me. Not even a little. The fire crackled softly nearby. Outside, snowflakes had begun drifting through the night air. For the first time, I told someone the truth. Not every detail. Not the entire story. Just enough. I explained how difficult the previous year had been. How certain family relationships had left me constantly questioning my worth. How criticism slowly became something I expected. How I learned to apologize even when I had done nothing wrong. The words came slowly. Carefully. Like someone opening windows inside a house that had remained closed for too long. When I finally stopped speaking, Adrian remained silent for several moments. Then he asked a question I never expected. Madison, when did you start believing that kindness toward yourself was something you had to earn? My breath caught. Because I did not have an answer. Or perhaps I did. I simply had never examined it before. Adrian leaned forward slightly. His voice remained calm. You spend your days helping children believe in themselves. You encourage them, protect them, support them. His eyes met mine. Why are you the only person excluded from that kindness? The question followed me long after I left the restaurant that night. Because deep down, I knew he was right. And for the first time, I began wondering what my life might look like if I treated myself with the same compassion I gave everyone else. Winter arrived quietly that year. One morning, I looked out the library windows and found the city covered in fresh snow. Children pressed their faces against the glass. Adults hurried down sidewalks carrying coffee cups and scarves. Everything looked softer beneath the white blanket. For the first time in a long while, I felt something inside me soften too. Not because my problems had disappeared. They had not. Not because I suddenly had all the answers. I did not. The difference was that I no longer felt completely alone carrying the questions. A few days before Christmas, Adrian invited me to attend a charity event hosted at one of his hotels. My first instinct was to decline. Large gatherings had never been my favorite thing. Too many people, too many conversations, too many opportunities to feel out of place. Yet something surprised me. Instead of immediately finding an excuse, I hesitated. That hesitation alone felt like progress. For months, maybe years, fear had made every decision before I even considered alternatives. This time I wanted to choose differently. The ballroom glowed with warm lights when I arrived. Families gathered around decorated trees. Volunteers organized gift donations for local schools. Children laughed near a table covered in art supplies. The atmosphere felt welcoming rather than intimidating. Adrian found me standing near the entrance and smiled. "You came." I almost did not. His expression softened. "I know." The honesty of that answer made me laugh. Throughout the evening, I watched him move through the crowd. He greeted guests, thanked volunteers, listened to staff members. Most people only noticed power when they looked at him. I was beginning to notice something else. Responsibility. He paid attention to people, the same way he had paid attention to me. Later, while helping organize donated books for children, I met several teachers from local schools. We exchanged stories about students and reading programs. The conversation flowed naturally. At some point, I realized I was enjoying myself. Not performing, not pretending, actually enjoying it. The realization felt unfamiliar. During a quiet moment near the end of the event, Adrian joined me beside a large window overlooking the snowy city. "You seem different tonight," he said. I smiled. That sounds familiar. Maybe because it is true. I looked out at the lights stretching across Chicago. I think I spent so long trying not to be a burden that I forgot people might actually want me around. The words escaped before I could edit them. Adrian remained silent for a moment. Then he shook his head gently. "Madison, you have spent your entire life making other people's days brighter." His gaze met mine. "Do you really believe your presence is a burden?" I opened my mouth to answer and stopped. Because for the first time, the idea sounded unreasonable. Not impossible. Just unfair. Unfair to myself. A small group of children ran past us carrying handmade ornaments and laughter. The moment felt ordinary. Yet, something important shifted inside me. Healing did not arrive like a lightning strike. It arrived in moments like this. Small realizations. Gentle corrections. The slow rebuilding of something that had been worn down over time. As snow continued falling outside, I stood beside the one person who had refused to look away, and for the first time in months, I began to believe that maybe my story was not about surviving difficult seasons. Maybe it was about learning that I deserved better ones. January arrived with clear skies and sharp winds sweeping across the city. The holiday decorations disappeared from storefronts, children returned to school, and life slowly settled back into routine. On the surface, everything looked ordinary. Yet inside me, something had changed. The constant pressure I carried for so long felt lighter. Not gone, just lighter. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to do something I had avoided for years. I visited my mother's house. The decision surprised even me. For months, I had spoken carefully around family conversations, avoiding difficult subjects and pretending old wounds no longer affected me. But Adrian's words continued following me. The people who care about you are not waiting for perfection. They are waiting for the truth. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. The same front porch. The same flower pots. The same wind chimes hanging near the door. Yet as I stepped inside, I noticed something different. Maybe the house had not changed. Maybe I had. My mother greeted me warmly. We shared coffee at the kitchen table. For a while, conversation remained comfortably ordinary. Weather, work, books. Then something unexpected happened. While searching for an old recipe, she opened a cabinet and accidentally knocked over a small wooden journal. The worn cover caught my attention immediately. "What is that?" I asked. My mother hesitated. Just for a second. Long enough for me to notice. "An old family journal," she said. "Nothing important." For some reason, I knew that was not true. Later that evening, she handed it to me before I left. "You are old enough to understand it now," she said quietly. The drive home felt longer than usual. I placed the journal on my coffee table and stared at it for nearly an hour before finally opening the first page. What I found was not what I expected. The journal belonged to my grandmother. Page after page described family memories, personal reflections, and observations about life. Then I reached an entry written nearly 20 years earlier. My breath caught as I read it. The words described a pattern that stretched through generations of women in my family. A pattern of silence. A pattern of believing that love had to be earned through sacrifice. A pattern of apologizing for taking up space. The journal did not describe dramatic events. It described beliefs. Quiet beliefs passed from one generation to the next until they became invisible. Suddenly, so many things made sense. My constant need to please everyone. My fear of disappointing people. My habit of carrying problems alone. None of it started with me. It had existed long before I was born. The discovery felt strange. Painful. Liberating. Both at the same time. The next evening, I brought the journal to Romano's. Adrian listened while I explained everything. When I finished, he sat quietly for several moments. Then he looked at the journal and smiled gently. "That is not a record of weakness," he said. "It is a record of survival." I stared at him. He continued. "Every generation did the best it could with what it knew. The difference is that now you know more." The restaurant lights reflected softly against the windows behind him. For the first time, I understood the real secret hidden inside the journal. The problem was never the women in my family. The problem was the belief that their needs mattered less than everyone else's. And sitting across from Adrian Romano, I realized I had finally been given something my grandmother never had. A chance to break the pattern. The decision arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning. No dramatic music. No life-changing speech. No sudden revelation. Just a quiet moment at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside me and my grandmother's journal open to the final page. Outside, the city was beginning to wake up. Cars moved through wet streets. People hurried toward work. Somewhere below my apartment window, a dog barked at nothing in particular. Life continued exactly as it always had. Yet I knew something was different. For weeks, I had been thinking about the patterns hidden inside my family history. The habit of making myself smaller. The instinct to apologize before speaking. The belief that my value depended entirely on what I could do for other people. Once I recognized those patterns, I could no longer pretend they were invisible. The question was simple. What would I do about them? That afternoon, I surprised everyone, including myself. At the library, a management position became available after a department supervisor retired. 6 months earlier, I would not have considered applying. I would have convinced myself that someone else was more qualified, more experienced, more deserving. Instead, I walked directly into my director's office and submitted my application. My hands trembled afterward. Not because I regretted it. Because I had finally done something without asking permission from fear first. Later that evening, I met Adrian for dinner. The restaurant buzzed with its usual energy. Staff moved between tables. Soft light reflected against polished wood surfaces. Everything felt familiar. Comfortable. When I told him about the application, a smile appeared immediately. "How do you feel?" he asked. I considered the question carefully. "Terrified." He laughed. "Good. Good. Terrified means you are growing." I shook my head, smiling despite myself. Adrian had an annoying talent for making difficult things sound simple. Yet as the conversation continued, I realized something important. He was not proud because I applied for the position. He was proud because I believed I deserved to try. The distinction mattered. A week later, another opportunity arrived unexpectedly. Emily invited me to speak at a literacy conference for educators across Illinois. The old version of me would have declined immediately. Public speaking meant attention. Attention meant judgment. Judgment meant risk. Instead, I heard myself say yes. The word left my mouth before fear could organize an argument against it. That night, I walked home through the city feeling strangely emotional. Not because anything extraordinary had happened. Because for the first time in years, I was making choices based on possibility rather than fear. A few days later, Adrian and I sat together near the restaurant window, watching snow melt beneath early signs of spring. Neither of us spoke much. We did not need to. Finally, he looked at me and asked a question. What do you want your life to look like a year from now? The question would have overwhelmed me months earlier. This time, the answer arrived surprisingly fast. Peaceful, I said. Honest. Full. Adrian nodded thoughtfully. That sounds achievable. I looked out at the city. For so long, my future felt like something happening to me rather than something I could shape. Now it felt different. The journal had revealed the pattern. Adrian had helped me see it. But changing it was my responsibility. My choice. And sitting there beneath the fading winter sky, I realized I was finally ready to choose myself. Not because someone rescued me. Because I finally understood that I was worth choosing. 1 year later, I stood at the front of a conference hall overlooking hundreds of educators from across Illinois. Sunlight streamed through tall windows. Conversations filled the room with energy and anticipation. A large screen behind me displayed the title of my presentation on literacy programs for underserved communities. If someone had shown me this moment 18 months earlier, I would have laughed and said they had the wrong person. The old version of me would never have volunteered to stand in front of a crowd. She would have worried about every possible mistake before taking the first step. But that woman was no longer in charge of my future. As the audience applauded at the end of my presentation, I felt something unfamiliar settle inside me. Pride. Not arrogance. Not perfection. Just quiet pride in how far I had come. Later that afternoon, I walked outside into the warm spring air. My phone buzzed with a message. Dinner tonight? Same table. Adrian. I smiled immediately. Some things changed. Some things remained beautifully consistent. That evening, Romano's felt exactly the way it had the night I first walked through its doors. Soft music. Warm lighting. Familiar faces. Yet everything was different because I was different. Adrian was already waiting when I arrived. The moment I approached the table, he stood and handed me a small gift box. What is this? I asked. Open it. Inside was the bookmark he had given me nearly a year earlier. The same one that carried 7 simple words. You deserve the same kindness you give. I looked up confused. Adrian smiled. Turn it over. My heart tightened as I flipped it around. On the back, engraved in elegant lettering, was a second sentence. One I had never seen before. Now you finally believe it. For several seconds, I could not speak. The restaurant faded into the background. The noise. The lights. The conversations. Everything disappeared except those words. Because they were true. Somewhere along the journey, I had stopped measuring my worth through other people's approval. I had stopped apologizing for existing. I had stopped believing that taking care of myself was selfish. Adrian had not fixed my life. He had done something far more important. He had seen me clearly when I could not see myself at all. We spent the evening talking about ordinary things. Work. Books. Travel plans. The future. The conversation felt effortless, the way meaningful conversations often do. When dinner ended, we stepped outside onto the sidewalk. The city shimmered beneath thousands of lights. People hurried past carrying shopping bags and coffee cups. Life moved forward around us. Adrian glanced toward me. Do you remember the first night we met? I laughed softly. Unfortunately, yes. You told everyone you were fine. I shook my head. I was very convincing. Not really. I rolled my eyes and he laughed. For a moment, we simply stood there watching the city. Then I realized something. The story had never been about hiding pain. It had been about finding the courage to stop hiding myself. The strongest part of healing was not being rescued. It was allowing yourself to be seen. As we continued walking beneath the glow of the city lights, I felt grateful for every difficult lesson, every honest conversation, and every step that brought me here. Because sometimes the person who changes your life does not save you from the world. Sometimes they simply remind you that you deserve a place in it.